The world has always been locked in a sort of, to use today's slang, an entanglement with psychology.
In the millions
of stories of mistreatment to the low-key medical malpractice that took place, the world has always had a bit of mystery, darkness, and in some cases like today, a bit of horror surrounding mental health. In the video today, I'm looking to explore one of the staples of psychology from its infancy, the asylum, and specifically the horror show that was Topeka State Hospital. My name is Warden Psychosis, and this is the Psychosis Asylum. First opening its doors in 1872 in Topeka, Kansas, Topeka State Hospital, which was formerly known as Topeka State Asylum, was an asylum built to help house criminals and the mentally ill, which I still don't get why we as people do that. I guess it's just easier to throw the mentally ill and criminals together than it is to actually deal with the problems that each are facing. Anyway, that's a whole tangent for another video. I won't get into it here. Anyway, by some accounts, the admissions back then were so lax that there were people being held in Topeka State Hospital who hadn't done anything wrong at all. And there's actually a story of that we're going to get into a little bit later. By the early 1900s, just a few short years after its opening, Topeka State Hospital had already gained a chilling reputation about the horrors going on inside the walls. Stories of neglect, rape, torture, and people being held in restraints for hours had already begun to circulate. One reporter even noted that a patient in the hospital had been held in their restraints for so long that their skin had begun to grow over the straps they were using to hold them, which is, let's just be honest, it's gross. Among the many horrors that took place within this hospital, and there are just so many, including one tragic murder, another thing Topeka State Hospital is infamously known for was its use of forced sterilizations, with a sizable portion of the state's grotesque operations taking place within the hospital itself. With the law shaping how the hospital behaved, forced sterilizations of patients began to increase rapidly from 1921 till about 1950, where they eventually slowed until ceasing altogether in 1961. At their peak in the 1930s, per 100,000 residents, Topeka State Hospital was performing about 10 sterilizations a year. Speaking of being falsely imprisoned, one such case involved a Danish immigrant by the name of John Crabbe. Mr. Crabbe was a dishwasher in Topeka and was known to have a bit of a temper despite his limited ability to speak English. One night in 1931, while at work, Mr. Crabbe saw a co-worker hitting on one of the waitresses who just so happened to be Mr. Crabbe's girlfriend, which angered Mr. Crabbe so much that he began making verbal threats against the co-worker. The police were called and Mr. Crabbe was subsequently arrested and taken to jail for his behavior. While in jail, Crabbe refused to cooperate and refused to eat anything, leading the police to bring in a mental health expert to assess Mr. Crabbe. The expert labeled Mr. Crabbe insane.
This man is insane.
He remained for nearly 20 years being labeled incurable. During his long stint inside, Mr. Crabbe repeatedly tried to convince the staff that he was indeed sane, but the staff reportedly said that, quote, one of the reasons they thought he was insane is because he was working so hard to prove that he was sane. This revelation naturally angered Mr. Crabbe even more, where he then refused to cooperate with the staff and refused to do any more work. John Crabbe might have actually died in Topeka State Hospital had it not been for a group of Danish insurance men who learned of his case. They took Mr. Crabbe's case to the authorities, where Mr. Crabbe was yet tested again, only this time he was labeled as sane. It then took another 10 months before Crabbe was finally released in 1950, having spent a total of 19 years being locked in a facility that he clearly didn't belong in. There have been numerous reports of assaults happening within the walls of Topeka State Hospital. One such famous case was the mysterious death of a patient by the name of J.I. Dodd. A witness came forward with the tale about the patient died and how he was being abused at the facility. There were numerous occasions where the witness saw an attendant knock Dodd to the ground, kick him, jump up and down on his chest. In some extreme cases, they'd seen the attendant attempt to strangle Dodd. On one fateful day, the eyewitness saw Dodd yet again get knocked to the ground, where this time he was dragged into room 18 of the facility. The door was slammed shut, where there were then sounds of a struggle. Finally, there was a groan, and sometime later, Dodd was carried out, dead, from whatever happened behind those closed doors. A county attorney, who was just, and rightfully so, absolutely horrified by the story, tried to take legal action against the attendant, but the then governor of Kansas refused to launch an investigation into the death, and the matter was dropped thereafter. No one really knows what happened behind the doors of room 18, but whatever it was cost one man his life, and any shot at retribution or justice sadly died with Mr. Dodd behind the closed doors of room 18. Topeka State Hospital was able to keep the tales of abuse and horror that went on in the inside of their walls largely due to their visitation policies, which were extremely limited. There were approximately 29 wards in Topeka State Hospital, and out of those 29, visitors were only allowed in 4. Parents couldn't see their children, friends of inmates weren't allowed to see patients at all, and had 0 visitation rights to their loved ones on the inside. Dr. T.C. Biddle, the hospital supervisor at the time, claimed that visitation would, quote, interfere with the patient's recovery, end quote. Oftentimes, patients who went into Topeka State Hospital were never seen again. Tragically, at least one person lost their life within the walls of Topeka State Hospital due to patient worker violence. Stephanie Ulrich worked as a music and activities coordinator, and sadly, her life was cut short by one of the patients in the hospital. I personally struggled on how to cover this topic because I don't want to spend too much time on the guy who killed her, but I think it's also important that I talk about this story because it is something that happened, and it is something that helps highlight just how nightmarish and how lax and seemingly uncaring that Topeka State Hospital truly was during its entire existence. Kenneth D. Waddle, a man who had been in the facility for an assault he committed on a young woman, having stabbed her twice, once in the back and once in the abdomen, was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the assault and was initially placed at another facility in Larned State Security Hospital. On April 1st, 1987, he was transferred to Topeka State Hospital, where he was placed in their Adult Forensic Unit, or the AWL unit, which was used to hold patients who were deemed higher risk than the general population. Due to budgetary cuts and constraints, this unit was eventually closed. When the unit was shut, all but a few of about 31 patients were mixed with the general population, said Mary Kopp of the Kansas State Nurses Association. Those few who were deemed the most violent, she noted, were sent elsewhere. On February 23rd, 1992, Stephanie Ulrich and another therapist took several of the general population patients off ground to see a movie, and among those was Kenneth Waddle. After returning from the outing and dropping off the other patients, it was then that Waddle attacked and strangled Miss Ulrich after she went to check on him while he was in the men's restroom. She was 30 years old and was survived by her 2 children and husband. Waddle was sentenced to life in prison, where he still resides today in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas, having most recently come up for parole in 2018, where he was denied, and he won't be considered again until August of 2028. The family later took Topeka State Hospital to court over the death of Miss Ulrich, asserting that the workplace/environment where Miss Ulrich worked was a negligent one that helped facilitate her murder. The United States Court of Appeals 10th Circuit decided on April 30th, 1995 that, quote, while Ulrich's murder was undeniably tragic, it was not the result of conscience-shocking conduct by the state mental health administrator sued in the instant case, thus affirming the district court's grant of defendant's motion for summary judgment. Basically, all that means for those of you who don't understand the legal jargon is the court ruled that Topeka State Hospital didn't put Miss Ulrich at substantial risk of serious harm, they didn't act recklessly in conscious disregard of that risk, or they didn't act in a conscience-shocking manner, so they weren't really ever held liable for her murder. Which to me, if I understand it correctly, is pretty tragic because they knew the risks in my opinion, like, I know the court didn't find them liable, but in my opinion, after all that I've read and all that I've researched, Topeka State Hospital was pretty messed up. And so to say that they weren't liable in her murder, again, I have to preface this by saying that they didn't find Topeka State Hospital liable. But to me, if I were the guys, oh, they would have paid the fucking price for it, because her murder was tragic and to me was avoidable. Like, it was entirely avoidable, and they just did not do that by some of the practices that they had in place at their facility. And it's messed up. She lost her life for nothing, really. Moving forward to another lawsuit in 2001, Cynthia Turnbull, a psychologist who started working at Topeka State Hospital in 1993, sued the facility and the state for sexual harassment after she was sexually assaulted by a patient. During the proceedings, the jury found that a sexually hostile work environment did indeed exist at Topeka State Hospital, but were ultimately split on whether or not the facility itself was to blame for it. After learning of the jury's inability to come to a conclusion, the district court granted an earlier defense motion for judgment as a matter of law, stating that, quote, the sole issue on appeal is whether that the ruling was proper. We hold that it was not and remand the case for further proceedings. The end of Topeka State Hospital was always on the horizon, but that demise was accelerated in 1988. The hospital lost its accreditation to receive federal Medicare and Medicaid payments. The Healthcare Financing Administration determined that the state had omitted 2 patients from its inspection of care review at the hospital, which appealed and lost, which is what began the beginning of the end of Topeka State Hospital. Linking back to the previous section, it was the losing of this funding that helped get their dangerous patient ward closed, which ultimately led to the death of Stephanie Ulrich. In the 90s, the hospital model of keeping mental patients had largely started to shift toward community-based programs, treating mental illness as a social welfare program, finding treatment through housing and employment. This shift that appeared to be working, along with the problems listed earlier, and mainly because they found it to be cheaper, the Kansas State Legislature decided that one of its 3 mental hospitals needed to close, and Topeka State Hospital was chosen for closure. Despite the funding issues that the facility faced, the numerous allegations of abuse, and the murder of Stephanie Ulrich on the grounds itself, Topeka State Hospital remained in operations for another 5 years after her tragic slaying, before finally being closed for good on May 17, 1997. The main facility building and many others remained empty yet standing until June of 2010, where they were finally demolished. I'm fully choosing to believe that Topeka State Hospital had good intentions when they opened their doors way back in 1872. I'm sure many of the doctors, nurses, psychologists, and other support staff had good intentions, but numerous tragedies, a bunch of human error, and in some cases outright malice plagued this place until the day their doors closed for good. This isn't the first time a story about abuses taking place at a mental health facilities has come up, and it won't even be the last time we cover something like this on this channel. But having a place like this open and remain in operation for 125 years kind of highlights the many problems that early psychology, and more specifically insane asylums, had to go through before finally finding their footing in the modern world, if they found that footing at all. Hopefully now you can gain a better perspective and appreciation for what modern psychology and the treatment of those in the field and in the asylums have gone through, now that you've stepped into mine. So, what did you think of the tale of Topeka State Hospital? Was it worse than you thought it'd be? Or more tame? Leave a comment in the comment section down below, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe and hit that bell so you get notified when I post another video. It'll really help my channel grow. To those who are just visiting, don't forget to sign the sign out sheet when you leave, and those who are choosing to stay, it's a lockdown time. Lights out. I'll see you next time.